All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of ICU. Today, we are going to get into the realm of food fear, and we're going to talk through different ways to get through that anxiety and stress surrounding eating. So my guest today is an intuitive eating dietitian from New York. This is Brittany Modell. Welcome, Brittany. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you. And also my Instagram handle is no food fear. So I feel like I'm your girl.
Perfect.
I'm on your side.
Honestly, I feel like I found you on Instagram through just like searching food fear or
Yes,
something like that. And I'm glad that I
amazing.
found you because I have been wanting to do an episode on this for a really long time because it's a issue that so many people with IC struggle with. And I think this is really gonna be helpful for so many people. So, can you just give the listeners a little intro on you and what being an intuitive eating RD is about?
Yeah. So for those who are unfamiliar with intuitive eating is a self-care framework that works on things such as body attunement, being able to listen to your body with non-judgment, and really being able to connect to your body in a way that feels helpful. And for so many people in our society, in our world, most people we know are on a diet.
Oh, yeah.
And, what this does is it further erodes any trust you have with your body, and it disconnects you from that body connection. So, what intuitive eating helps us to do is to help us reconnect to that inner intuitive eating voice that we all have and that we were all born with. But sometimes, with certain messages we receive, kind of gets thrown to the side for some time. And so,
Yeah.
as an intuitive eating dietitian, I really help clients heal their relationship with food by creating more body trust, building more awareness around how their body feels, honoring their hunger, giving themselves permission to eat foods without any guilt, without food fears, and just really, building that connection back to their body that often is missing.
Hmm. Yeah. No, you're so right about everyone being on a diet. Like, it's a product of our society and the media and social media. It's like I'm pretty sure I was on my first diet in high school, but I was thinking about my food choices in a negative way back in middle school.
Yeah.
And that was, not that I blame my mom for this, but it was the message she was sending to me because she was on a diet.
Yes. Yeah. Parents model, when they're on diets, and there is such a thing as like generational dieting trauma. It's like your grandparents, your parents, and it's not that parents or grandparents are trying to cause harm. It's like they can only, teach what they were taught and what they know. And I think the hardest part is so much disordered eating is normalized that people don't realize that how they're eating is disordered. And now you have social media and TikTok and Instagram and all these other influences that, kids are hearing these messages and in even earlier age than when we were, at that age.
Absolutely. I used to work as a weight loss dietitian
Same.
before I had
Yep.
a huge transition in
Yep.
what I was doing, but I used to see a lot of kids come in and parents would just be like, I've been restricting them. And I'd be like, ugh, that is not what you should be doing.
Yes.
So, I was in that area for about 2 years. And then I went through my own disordered eating journey. And actually, what made me realize that I wasn't living the life I wanted and like needed to quit that job was I read this book about intuitive eating, and I'm sure you know it. It was written by two women named Ellen, I think.
Is it Evelyn and Elise Resch?
Evelyn and Elise.
Yes.
They both started with an E.
Yes. So Evelyn
Okay.
and Elise, they are the like co-founders of intuitive eating.
Yeah. No, that book like changed my life. And I have not been on a diet ever since. And it ultimately led me to starting this business and helping the IC community. So I think it was all meant to be. Now, when it comes to dieting in this community, it takes on a different purpose. So instead of, trying to lose weight or whatever the reason may be, we are on day one. When we get that diagnosis, we are handed the IC diet list, told that these foods, this list of 10 to 20 foods, can cause us a flare up essentially, and can make our symptoms worse. And so they put you on what they call the IC diet. And there's a lot of, as I said, we'll get into it, but the purpose is to minimize symptoms rather than lose weight. So it's kind of different, but I feel like you are absolutely still going to help everyone understand, how the restrictive mindset is unhelpful.
Yeah. And we see this a lot in other chronic conditions as well. So when I'm meeting with clients who have autoimmune diseases and other like inflammatory diseases and Lyme's disease, and I understand that there is such a want and a need to feel symptom relief. And when I meet with clients, they're pretty much desperate to try anything that works. But something that I often bring up is we cannot dismiss the importance of mental health. And so if we're so focused on eating these 10 foods, or we're so focused on eating this diet, my question is, what impact does that have on your mental health and your stress and your anxiety and your mood? Because we don't want to dismiss that, because if you're eating quote unquote perfectly and eating the described diet, but your mental health is really suffering, and you can't socialize, you can't make those connections, and you can't do all these things, then is this actually helping? And so that's kind of one question that I usually pose for a lot of my clients who do kind of suffer with some of these chronic conditions. But I think it's important to kind of take a step back and realize that like there isn't any nutrition evidence that is perfect. They all have their flaws. And so although this might be written like this could potentially help, it is not 100% guaranteed to create symptom relief. And that's why we want to really listen to each and every person on an individual basis and say like, is this actually helping you? And if there are some foods when they limit them or they remove them from their diet and they do feel symptom relief, that's wonderful. But it's such a person by person experiment, and it's really trial and error. So we want to make sure that someone feels connected enough to their body, which is what we do with intuitive eating, to make sure that they're eating in a way that is really supporting them from both like a physical and also like an emotional standpoint.
Yeah. Oh my God. So true. So I guess we could take this a couple directions. So why don't we start with, okay, a person is handed that IC diet list, doctor doesn't explain it to them. They have all of these feelings of maybe panic, like grieving the loss of their favorite foods. So how would you recommend those people proceed?
So the first thing I would say, I would validate how they're feeling and say it's so normal to feel this sense of, grief and a sense of confusion. I also want to say, and this might not be taken well, I don't know, but doctors are not gods.
Oh,
doctors don't
know that's everything. The vibe on this podcast. You're fine.
Okay. Doctors do not know everything. And when it comes to nutrition, that's not what they spend their time researching. They don't spend their time focusing. They're kind of given that one sheet. And the reason they don't really dive into it is because they don't, oftentimes like they're focusing on other symptoms, other symptom management. I'm not poo-pooing doctors. I think they're incredible, but I do get frustrated when a doctor, gives really blanket nutrition advice and they're like, okay, go on and do your own thing. And then all of a sudden they're creating disordered eating and an eating disorder and, severe food anxiety. So with that, I would kind of recommend sitting with that list, first of all, are there any foods on there that you're like, I am devastated to have to take off this list? Are there foods that you're like, this is something that I eat all the time? Like, this is something that makes up a lot of my diet.
Like non-negotiables?
Non-negotiables. And again, we don't know for sure if, you know, taking gluten out of your diet is, and I'm saying gluten, I don't know if this is necessarily just like in general, with a lot of these anti-inflammatory diets that I've seen with chronic diseases, they were like, oh, like remove dairy and gluten and all these other things. Now, you could very well have no response when you take it out. It might not have any symptom relief. And now you're taking out some of your favorite foods that are a huge part of your diet, and it's going to impact you way more negatively than it would if you were including them. So again, it's so person by person, but I would explore what different foods feel like for you, and, you know, start to create awareness around, okay, like I'm noticing that I'm experiencing like the symptoms for IC more intensely when I'm eating this food or when I'm having this food. And just starting to build awareness, maybe even like journaling without it being very rigid. Just again, we're trying to build awareness around what foods might create some symptoms.
So not going cold turkey right away.
I wouldn't go, you know, I would not go cold turkey right away, because what that does is it creates more stress and anxiety for the person around food. Now, if someone were to come to me and they were like, I have celiac disease, and when I have gluten, I am having like a actual autoimmune reaction, that is a very different story.
Right. We'll take that out.
Yeah, but it's hard when we don't know. We don't have enough information. And so I'm not saying that it can't help. It might very well help, but it sounds like a lot of these foods have not been like extremely well established in their research to make me as a clinician, like confident to say like, take these foods out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a fantastic point you bring up, is especially with IC, we don't have a whole lot of research with the IC diet. Yes, there is some, but when it comes to diet, we can't isolate diet alone. With IC, there's factors like stress, hormones, allergies, and a ton of other things that could be causing symptoms. And so that's where it gets really difficult to identify those triggers. It's because there's so many different things happening. And that's where moving forward, the research will be difficult, and hopefully we can find a way. Now, it's just such a difficult thing. And so I lost my train of thought, of course.
Well, can I add something to what
yes,
you were saying?
please save me from this.
There are different factors. And so let's say if stress is one of the factors, and if we are giving someone a very restrictive diet and telling them to adhere to this diet, remove all of your favorite foods, and you know, you can't socialize as much, you have to worry every time you go out to eat, that is going to increase someone's stress. So if we know that stress is a large factor and we are eating in a way that is increasing stress, we need to really sit back and ask, like, how helpful is it to adhere to this rigid diet? And that's how I feel across the board. Again, with all these chronic conditions, it's like, we don't want to dismiss the mental health impact that having a restrictive diet can have, because it can really impact someone's stress levels.
Mm-hmm. That is so true. We live in such a food-centered society that you can't socialize without food being involved. And so if you're not able to eat any of the options at a restaurant or at like a family gathering or whatever it may be, that can really decrease your quality of life.
Exactly. And so it's, you know, it's something to keep in mind. And going back to food fears, it's like, okay, so I'm hearing this, but like, how do I actually put this into practice? I would invite you to make a list of food rules that you have or food beliefs and kind of start from there. So examples of a food rule could be, I can't eat after 7 p.m. Now,
That is the one that just popped into my mind. I'm so glad you said
so
that.
Funny.
Yeah.
And listen, if we have evidence, right? So like, for example, I know if I drink water after 10 p.m., I will have to go to the bathroom more. That there is that's substantial evidence. There is no evidence to support that your body all of a sudden can't metabolize, can't break down foods, can process foods come 7 p.m. That's definitely one of those myths that diet culture loves to perpetuate. So another rule or belief, right? Another belief could be carbs are bad for me. So we want to really challenge these food rules and food beliefs and ask ourselves, like, do we have evidence to support this? What has my personal experience been in the past as it relates to this rule or belief? And is this helpful for what I'm trying to accomplish? And those are the three parts that I often will take clients through when it comes to, really challenging those food beliefs and food rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember going through my food rules way back when, and like, you don't realize how, I'm just going to say the word crazy it sounds, but I don't actually mean crazy. But I used to think, oh, I can't have a dessert with my lunch. Dessert has to be like after dinner. And like, I had these really strange rules to me. Once I like wrote them out on paper, I was like, oh, what am I doing? Like, you can eat a cookie at lunchtime.
And something to add too is like, where did this rule come from?
Right.
Like, maybe this is something that when you were raised, like there was no dessert with lunch. And that's why you were, taught growing up that there was only dessert with dinner. We're not born with any of these rules or any of these beliefs. Like, these have been taught over time. The good news is that we can challenge them and start to unlearn a lot of the patterns and behaviors that we have been told our entire lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I kind of wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the chronic illness population. Like, we are just desperate to find relief. And I think when people see somebody having success with a restrictive diet out there, like going gluten-free, they latch onto that and they say, okay, I'm desperate. I need to try this. And then they end up keep trying different fad diets that they see are working for other people. But the thing to remember is those people aren't you. And this one diet doesn't work for everyone. We don't have that evidence.
100%. And this actually reminds me a lot of like something like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Some people are like, oh, like just go gluten-free and dairy-free. And there actually really is no evidence to support that. And so, yeah, like I am not disagreeing that someone's lived experience might be like they genuinely feel better when they go gluten-free or dairy-free, but we don't have enough information to support that every person who goes gluten-free and dairy-free will find relief in their symptoms. Same thing with this. Like, we don't have that evidence, not to say that someone might not feel better, because again, everyone's experience is unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's important to mention the risks of following a restrictive diet. I mean, one of the most important ones is your physical health. You can develop nutrient deficiencies. And that's why we always recommend working with a dietitian to make sure that you're talking through the diet first, but actually implementing a restrictive diet. I think that's the safest thing to do. Do you agree?
I mean, I think if someone is able to speak with a dietitian, we are able to support you in making sure that your needs are being met. I think that a lot of these online diets and fad diets, they're not actually interested in your health, because if a diet is interested in your health, they're not cutting out an entire food group for absolutely no reason. Mm-hmm. And so and it's also, the other thing to think about too, is like a lot of those diets are not sustainable at all.
Yeah.
So we want to find a way to eat that feels good for you physically, but also is something that you can do forever. And that feels, emotionally compatible, and all these other factors that are, again, equally as important to our health.
Right. You're not going to do keto your whole life. You're not going to do the carnivore diet your whole life. Although somebody's probably going to come at me for saying that.
Right.
They're not sustainable. And that's the thing. The IC diet was not created to be followed long term. I can't say that enough. It was designed to guide an elimination diet. And that's the disconnect that people aren't understanding. You're not supposed to follow the IC diet long term. So that is probably the biggest disconnect. But the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was just the phrase elimination diet. Like, that's scary as it is.
Yeah. And I think it can feel overwhelming. And it's one of those things, like, we all have this inner child rebel within us. Like, when you tell someone don't do something, don't eat something, don't drink something, it's only going to make them want to eat it and drink it and consume it even more.
Yep.
And I do think that for, some conditions, like an elimination diet can be helpful if there's, again, like research to kind of guide it. But I also think we want to take the whole person into account. Does this person have a history of chronic dieting? Does this person have a history of an eating disorder or disordered eating? Because if they do, that to me is a sign that an elimination diet is not going to be worth going down that road. Mm-hmm. If this is something that you have struggled with in the past and could maybe trigger some past pretty harmful behaviors. And that's the other kind of thing we want to think about as well.
Yeah, no, I have a handful of people in my program that have histories of eating disorders, and I make sure to really monitor them and make sure that they're being supported and nothing is getting out of hand. And if some feelings come up, we work together to find a solution. So they're never left on their own. But I have noticed I would say more eating disorders / disordered eating habits in the IC community than I thought when I joined the IC world. So, there's just so many people out there that are terrified of eating because they've been told that these things are going to cause them pain. So why would they even try? And people they get stuck in that elimination phase, I guess you could call it, where they're eating the same foods over and over again. And the longer you do that, A, you can develop those nutrient deficiencies, but B, it's really gonna mess up your mental health.
Yeah. And it makes sense that any chronic condition that actually like recommends disordered patterns of eating. And, again, we see this with PCOS, we see this with Lyme disease, we see this with different autoimmune diseases, we see this with IC. It does not surprise me because any condition that, again, is creating more rigidity around eating, that leads to more disordered eating. And as we know, disordered eating is very normalized. So you might go to a doctor and say, I'm eating this way, X, Y, Z, and they're like, great. And they don't think, oh, that's actually quite disordered because, again, it is so normalized in our society. And so as dietitians, it's so important that we at least can recognize, you know what, this seems a little disordered. How can we invoke some like flexibility with your eating? What would it be like if, you couldn't work out or you ate something that you deemed bad? Like, how would that impact you? Because oftentimes people don't even realize that what they're doing is disordered.
Mm-hmm. So true. Yeah. I always call it like a stress reaction where people will eat a bad food or an IC unfriendly food, and they may not even be sensitive to it, but they have a bunch of guilt, they have worry. And so that cranks up the dial on our nervous system, and then that causes a flare. So it's like, either way, you're losing, right?
Right. And you're almost better off not stressing. You are better off not stressing about food, because otherwise, the stress itself can create a flare. The stress itself can impact your health. And so, yeah, it's really, really challenging. And I can imagine it's frustrating force anyone who is just trying to get answers, and they're doing everything they can to feel better, to feel symptom relief. And it makes sense to latch on to something like a diet, because in some ways it feels like they can get some control back over a situation that they really don't have much control over.
Yeah. And I think social media has really added fuel to the fire with diets for chronic illnesses. I think there's a lot of like influencers that are like, I went gluten-free, dairy-free, and I cured my condition. It's like,
right.
No, you didn't. Like that. I'm calling bullshit on that one.
Yeah. Yeah.
It drives me crazy. And the other thing that really grinds my gears is there's doctors out there who will tell their IC patients to lose weight and that'll help. And it's like, no, you have no evidence.
Sorry. I almost have to laugh because
yeah,
it is like, no matter what the condition is, like I could have a client go in, they're like, I have a stomach ache. They're like, you need to lose weight. It's like, I have a toothache. You know what could really help you? Why don't you lose weight? Mm-hmm. And I call it lazy medicine and lazy healthcare, because it's like, I don't really want to figure out what's going on with you. And I don't want to help you to figure out how to manage symptoms. So just like lose weight is a really easy way to kind of get out of giving any, real medical advice.
Yeah. It's kind of a cop out.
Yeah, it is.
Drives me nuts, because then people will do something like intermittent fasting or keto, and it's just so dangerous. So,
and again, think about what that does to somebody's stress levels.
Yeah. Yeah. And those diets will create a really unhealthy relationship with food. So I guess, the last few minutes that we have, I want to talk about how people who are suffering from food fear can, like, what they can do to get out of that mindset. Like,
yes.
Are there certain things you recommend?
So because dieting and disordered eating is so around us, I would say create your own kind of community of people that you can feel safe with. Follow non-diet dietitians, follow intuitive eating counselors, follow people that are approaching health in a non-diet way. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is if you are a non-diet or like a dietitian or someone who is not focusing on weight, somehow you don't care about health. Being anti-diet is not the same as being anti-health. We still very much incorporate gentle nutrition and focus on getting your needs met and all these other factors. We're just not focused on weight. So again, surrounding yourself with other like-minded individuals, listen to podcasts. There are so many different books. You mentioned Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch. There is I think their 4th edition is out, and they also have an amazing workbook that accompanies it, which I love. And I often actually bring into sessions, but it has just a lot of different exercises and activities that someone can kind of go through to help kind of combat these food fears. But, put the book away, or put the book to the side and the podcast to the side. I would say going through, again, writing down your own food rules, your own food beliefs, and starting to challenge each one. If you begin to notice, well, I have a ton of food fears and I have a lot of different foods that I'm scared of, start by introducing them one by one. So if you fully eliminated foods from your diet, can you start to introduce them one by one and just, again, notice how you're feeling? Do you feel any different? Or is this a food that you can put back into your repertoire? You can start to, incorporate more routinely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the tough part is with IC, if you consume a trigger, it can take up to 3 days for that reaction to show. So that's where it gets tricky.
So even having it maybe for a few days in a row and seeing what that's like, and just, again, focusing on that one food at a time could be one way to see, like, okay, is this a food that, is not having an impact, or maybe it is having an impact. The last piece to this too, I would say, is having self-compassion. None of this is your fault. None of this is continuing because of things that you're doing. Our bodies are just, they're really cool. And sometimes they do things that don't necessarily align with how we want them to act and behave. But I think it's important to continue to incorporate self-compassion, remind yourself that this isn't your fault. And, by eating some of your favorite foods, you're not destroying your health. You're not, making IC so much worse. There's so many different factors, as we talked about, and other ways to bring relief to your body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree with everything you're saying, like writing out those food rules, finding a support system that is not focused on the diet side of things. Yeah. And just giving yourself grace, I think, is one of the biggest things. It's like, okay, you ate something that you knew was a trigger. You don't need to feel guilty about that. You're only human. Like you said, we want what we can't have or what we're told we can't have. So I think it's important to have that self-compassion and just move forward after something like that. Like progress isn't linear. It's definitely going to be like a roller coaster to get to where you want to be.
Absolutely. And again, just having that compassion, not judging yourself, and just trying to learn. Like this is all just a way to learn more about your body, more about your condition. And that's it. Like we're not, there is no pass or fail here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, if somebody is listening and they think that they might have an eating disorder, who would you recommend them reach out to?
So I would look for an eating disorder dietitian in your area and an eating disorder therapist. So oftentimes if people want to go, for example, through insurance, like there are ways to do that, but someone who is well-versed in eating disorders, it also depends on the spectrum. There are plenty of dietitians who work with people with disordered eating, for example. Mm-hmm. But if you are someone who has like binging or purging, or, if you have anorexia, something like that, it will require support, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so getting support from a therapist and a dietitian, both of who specialize in eating disorders. And maybe the first step, if you don't know where to find someone, is talk to your internist, talk to your PCP and say like, listen, I've been struggling with this. Like, do you have someone that you can refer me to or recommend? Because I think I may have an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And I will say, like, a lot of people think, well, I'm not sick enough to have an eating disorder. But if it is impacting your quality of life on a day-to-day basis, that is enough of a reason to go seek help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us your time. I know it's precious. You're helping so many people, and I know through this episode, you're going to help so many more. So thank you for coming on, Brittany. And why don't you tell the listeners where they can follow you again? I know you already said it, but is there a website? Let us know.
Yeah. So my Instagram and TikTok accounts are No Food Fears. So at No Food Fears. My podcast is called Food Therapy, and you can find it on any platform where you listen to podcasts. And my website is Brittany Modell, RD.com.
Okay. I'm literally typing your TikTok in so that I can stalk you, because I love seeing dietitians on TikTok.
Honestly, I wish I was like more, I'm on TikTok a lot consuming TikToks, but I wish I could be one of those people who like post content 3 times a day. I post
content 5 times a day. So I am that person.
Amazing. Well, I will follow you back.
Yes. Follow me back. I'll post all of that in the show notes. And then, yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.